Last year, you people spent approximately $235 billion on national defense. As an observer, I might ask the question, why? And of course, Dan Rather and the 6 o'clock news has been telling you for years that the reason for that is to protect us from the communist menace from the East. That is, those Russian hordes who are going to impose upon us a foreign and an alien ideology. And of course, we're prepared to spend $1,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States on national defense to prevent that from happening. How many of you in this audience tonight are practicing communists? May I see your hands? Let the record show that only one hand was raised out of this audience. Take a good look around, ladies and gentlemen, because in this audience we have one practicing communist and all of the rest of you are something else. Let's take a look at what else you might be. What else could you be? The communist menace in the United States, let me pause a moment and pull out one of my files, is so prolific in this country that the FBI is having a hard time keeping track of all of the communists. Did you know that? They estimate that there are some 10 to 15,000 communists from the Eastern Bloc countries in the United States, and they don't have enough agents to keep up with them. So if I were to ask you tonight, would you go out and bring one of those communists in so that the rest of us can see what one looks like? Because in this audience, we only have one. And what we want to do is to take a look at what they look like so that we can avoid them like AIDS, herpes, and VD. Because after all, we don't want anything to do with that foreign and alien ideology. In 1848, a fellow by the name of Karl Marx wrote a treatise called The 10 Planks to the Communist Manifesto. It's the foundation of what communist ideology is all about. And, of course, we here in the Western world are practitioners of something that's exactly the opposite of these 10 planks, whatever that might be. Let me ask you now, how many of you in here are Christians? Do we have any Christians in the audience? Let the record show that with the exception of the one man who's a practicing communist, everybody else in here, for all practical purposes, is a Christian. That's wonderful, because now the lines are clearly drawn for all of us between the Christians in the United States and the communists in the Soviet Union. I'm from Idaho, and up in Idaho we have some practices going on up there that I thought that I would bring down here and share with you. Some interesting new concepts have been put into practice in the state of Idaho that will be totally foreign to you people here. Christians, of course, will not understand this application of the Communist Manifesto. Communists, of course, would understand it in a moment. If we were in Warsaw, Gdansk, or Prague, the average man on the street, you know, the practicing communist, he'd stand out like a sore thumb. But over here in the United States, these communists evidently blend in with all the rest of us, and it's very difficult for us to identify one. Are they male or female? Are they 6 foot tall or are they short? Do they have bald heads or hair? Do they wear hats or do they go bareheaded? Do they have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 legs, 1 nose? No, up in Idaho they're so difficult to tell that unless you look at what they practice and what they do every morning when they get up, you wouldn't be able to tell an Idaho communist from a Russian, a Pole, or a Czech communist. They look so similar. They are so deceiving. It's why the IRS, or excuse me, the FBI and our other government agents and agencies are unable to identify the communists in our midst. Let's take a little test and a little review of these 10 planks to see just what communists do when they get up in the morning to go to work. The first plank to the Communist Manifesto, remember this now, was published in 1848. Not 1936 or 1952, but 1848. First plank. calls for the abolition of property in land and the application of all rent in land to public purposes. Well, at first blush, that's a little ambiguous. Just exactly how would we put that into practice if we were a communist? Well, up in Idaho, there's about 88,000 square miles of real estate, and of the 88,000 square miles, 64% of it's owned by the federal and the state governments. 36% is owned by individuals, private landowners, small businessmen, people just like you. Of that 64%, the BLM and the Department of Agriculture control almost all of it. Farmers up there rent land from the BLM to graze their cattle on. The money is then taken and used for the general fund. It's sent to Washington. When there's a timber sale, the proceeds of those timber sales go to Washington, to the general fund. Those are rents on public land. What about the other 36%? Well, up in Idaho, 75% of the entire state budget is spent on public education. Let me repeat that. 75 cents out of every tax dollar in Idaho goes to public education. I went to a committee meeting one time and I suggested that they give 100% to the teachers and the public schools. And forget about all other activities of government. And that way the teachers wouldn't have to come back every year and lobby for more money. That way they'd have it all. They're there every year anyway. I suppose every year they must want a little more. So next year they want 78%, and the year after 80 and 85 and 90, 95. Give it all to them, and then we don't need the legislature to come in and pass a lot of other screwy laws. Well, getting back to the point, the other 36% of the land then is taxed. Every square foot of Idaho is taxed. It's called a land tax, and that money is used for public purposes. The first plank to the Communist Manifesto was practiced in its entirety and its total application by everybody in the state of Idaho every day of their lives. And the 10th plank to the Communist Manifesto calls for the free education of all children in public schools. Let me tell you how that scam works. We have public schools in every town and village, every hamlet, and all of the teachers are publicly financed. All of the schools are publicly financed. They have statutes there and laws. They force everybody to send their children to the public schools, and those who are rebels, those people are put in the state penitentiary and their children are taken away from them. How many of you people in this audience have ever been to a public school? Oh, my goodness. Are you from Idaho? I thought you people down here were different. Well, surely there must be some differences here between Arizona and Idaho. The second plank that I want to bring to your attention calls for the heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Boy, that's a real sleeper. There's an agency in Idaho called the Idaho State Tax Commission, and then there's a federal agency called the IRS. That's a euphemism for Internal Revenue Service. Those are government agencies. They take 17 to 75% of all of the productivity of every person who works in the state of Idaho. The reason that I want to warn you about that is that somebody might suggest that you people institute an income tax in the state of Arizona. Let me warn you that it could cost you a lot of money. 17 to 75% of everything you create and produce. In 1900, if you'd have suggested that to your great-grandfather, he would have responded by, "That's preposterous." I agree. The third plank calls for the abolition of all right of inheritance, and in Idaho there is no right to inheritance. We have an inheritance tax there. It takes about 28 to 35% of the estate. The people in Idaho practice this inheritance law. They have replaced the old law of Moses calling for the inheritance of the family lands going to the firstborn son, and now the people up there get marriage licenses and they buy and sell land in violation of Leviticus 25:23. Having then abolished the common law practice to inheritance, they've now adopted the civil law practice, and with a three-party contract by way of the marriage license, when Sally and Joe marry, they do so by creating a limited general partnership with the state of Idaho, so that now there's 3 partners: Joe, Mary, and the state. And then when Joe dies, Mary wants all of the bonds and the stocks, the houses, the condominiums, the cars, the motorcycles, all of the toys that they've accumulated all of their lives. And the state simply comes in and says, buy me out. And they always want cash. This necessitates then the sale of all the toys to raise the cash to buy the third partner out. That's the third plank to the Communist Manifesto. In the event that somebody would suggest an inheritance tax in place of your inheritance law under the common law, let me suggest that you think it through very carefully. It'll cost you 1/3 of everything you create and produce when your spouse dies. Now, the fourth plank calls for the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Up in Idaho, some people are beginning to rebel against the 75% tax. And in order to keep those people in line, we have things called SWAT teams, highway patrolmen, IRS special tax task forces, and other governmental agencies. They padlock businesses, lien houses and properties, seize bank accounts, and jail people without due process or equal protection. You might want to keep that in mind, because in Idaho, the fourth plank to the Communist Manifesto is in full force and effect every single day. Number 5 calls for the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Up in Idaho, we practice this with little green pieces of paper. No one uses gold and silver coin. Everyone uses Federal Reserve notes. They're issued by the Federal Reserve banks nationally, and they're distributed by our local banks like Idaho First National. Oh, it's nice to know that you people here in Arizona, of course, use gold and silver pursuant to your Constitution. Number 6 calls for the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. This is accomplished by the Federal Communications Commission. Every radio and television station, every newspaper, every means of communication, whether it be mass or local media, is in some form of corporate or juristic capacity, and they're licensed and regulated by the state. The means of transportation is controlled by ports of entry. Every truck moving across the state must enter these ports of entry, even though Article 1, Section 9 of the Federal Constitution says, no state shall compel any vessel to enter, clear, or pay duties in a port of entry. In the event that someone brings up the suggestion that you establish way stations and ports of entry in your state, you might want to consider that 6th plank. The 7th calls for the extension of factories and the instruments of production owned by the state, and the bringing into cultivation of wasteland and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. This is accomplished in our state by use of FMC, J.R. Simplot, and other agribusinesses. In fact, every business in Idaho is an extension of factories and the instruments of production owned by the state, and they're called corporations. In the event that you have someone suggest corporate capacity and corporations in your state, you might want to keep the 7th plank of the Communist Manifesto in mind. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands is accomplished by use of the Desert Land Entry Act. You can buy land from the state, and you can farm it as long as you get a permit to drill a well and a permit to draw the right amount of water out of the ground and a permit to grow what the state recommends that you grow on that land. And then finally, the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan in Idaho is called soil conservation districts. Watch that one, it's a sleeper. In the Soviet Union, they call them central planning and state farms. In Idaho, we call them soil conservation districts, and corporate agribusiness. Number 8 calls for the equal liability of all to labor and the establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. This equal liability of all to labor is accomplished in Idaho by means of the Social Security account. Everybody belongs to the industrial army. It works just like the Army, Navy, and Marines. You can't get a job without one. Every business has either a Social Security account, a federal tax number, a state tax number, and or a sales tax number. Many businesses have all 4. Number 9 calls for the combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries and the gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population over the country. This has been accomplished in this country since 1922, when we reached the peak of private land ownership. In 1920, when the census was taken, the United States had approximately 100 million people. 2 years later, we reached the zenith of private land ownership with 47 million people, nearly 1 in every 2 persons owning land. Land under the common law is the foundation of all wealth, because all wealth comes from the land, and without private ownership of land, there can be no private rights under the Bill of Rights. Well, by 1940, the number of private landowners had dropped from 47 million to 32 million. But of course, this equitable distribution of the population over the land was excused by the Dust Bowl and the Depression years. Between 1940 and 1950, the number dropped from 32 million to 15 million. And the reason? Well, we just went through World War II, and we needed Sam the farmer and his wife to go to Detroit to build airplanes and ships for the war. Between 1950 and 1969, the number further declined from 15 million to 6 million. Between 1969 and 85, the number dropped from 6 million to 3 million in 1985. At this time, there are 268,000 farm foreclosures going on across the United States every year. By the turn of the century, every one of you will be more equitably redistributed, or redistribution will have been accomplished over the United States. And of course, the 10th plank, the free education of all children in public schools. Now, if we were to reflect on what we've just read and what we have just heard, I asked the question, why did you spend $235 billion last year on national defense? And of course, the obvious answer is to protect us from the atheistic hordes of communism from imposing upon us a foreign and alien ideology. That's a strange goal. We're spending that kind of money to put our boys in 52 countries around the world. We're making a lot of dust, stirring up a lot of animosity, doing a lot of transportation, really doing things around the world, creating armies, navies, marines, foreign policy. Why? Is there some reason why we're doing that? How many of you in here practice any or all of these 10 planks? Do we have any hands? Or we have a few more hands going up now. Well then, let's take a look at the worst possible scenario and let's see what would happen. Let's suppose that Gus Hall, the president of the American Communist Party, were inaugurated as president of the United States tomorrow morning. And what would he do? Well, of course, he would abolish the Republicans and the Democrats, and he'd do away with our right to vote, wouldn't he? No more elections, and no more Republicans or Democrats. He would abolish the Congress. And then he'd probably install communists in their place, and then communists would be installed as your police chief, and communist sympathizers would probably be put on your highway patrol, and they'd carry nightsticks and guns on their sides and probably drive around in patrol cars and called themselves troopers or something like that. Let's see. What else would the communists do? Oh, they would abolish all of the state legislatures and all of the state governments and replace all of those people with communists. Everybody in public office would be a communist. And they'd change our flag, and we'd have some red flag with a hammer and sickle instead of a flag with red, white, and blue in it. How would that change your life, though, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock? What would be different? What would you do differently tomorrow than you did today, or yesterday, or last month? Why is it that you people are spending $1,000 for every man, woman, and child to defend yourselves against a practice that you practice every day of your lives? Looked upon in the cold, hard light of high noon, we ought to ask ourselves, wouldn't it be better if we just stopped spending anything on national defense and let the communists take over? What difference would it make? Just 85 years ago, not one of these 10 planks to the manifesto were in practice in any of the states of the United States. Your great-grandfather used gold and silver coin. He didn't practice the 5th plank to the manifesto by use of Federal Reserve notes in 1900. Not one of these planks were being practiced in this country or in this state just 85 years ago, and the last one, the 10th plank, wasn't really put into place at the federal level until the National Education Act of 1954, remember? Now, I asked the question a little while ago, how many of you are practicing Christians? Do we still have any? Uh-oh. Take a good look around, everybody. Raise your hands high, you practicing Christians. Because now, if you're practicing these 10 planks, as everyone said they weren't doing when we started, and now everybody says, yes, I guess we are using Federal Reserve notes, sending our children to public schools, paying a income tax, and practicing the confiscation of the property of immigrants and rebels by way of SWAT teams, etc. Now this leaves you in the ludicrous position of calling yourself a Christian communist, doesn't it? Now, have you taken a look at private property in America in the last 30 years? Let me illustrate. You know, America between 1787 and 1950, without any foreign aid, without the International Monetary Fund, became the wealthiest and most powerful, prosperous nation and people on earth. And when it was all said and done, by 1950, we could say that we have 15 of the leading industries in the world. America in 1950 was number 1 in steel production, number 1 in auto production, number 1 in coal production. We were number 1 in nearly every major industrial activity. And 35 years later, in 1985, we are number 1 in one last major industrial enterprise. That's aircraft production. And by the 1990s, we are expected to be number 2 behind Western Europe. Something has changed in America in 85 years, and I submit that something has radically changed in just 35 years. Something's different now. You know, people in Poland don't make any pretense to owning private property. They don't call themselves homeowners. In America, we like to deceive ourselves somewhat. We call ourselves landowners and farmers, property owners, and what is the real status of our property ownership in America? The real bottom line is that there is no proper private property in America. All private property has been subjugated in America to the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. People who are practicing communists don't have freedoms like our forefathers enjoyed in 1900. Practicing communists in the Soviet Union don't have the kind of freedoms that we were practicing in this country just 85 years ago. In fact, just 35 years ago. What would happen in America if we made some fundamental and radical changes and we started to adopt a policy and plan to do that which we were doing in 1900? Do you suppose that there would be some meaningful changes if we were to make some meaningful changes? That's why I do Lesson 1. That's the purpose of this lesson, is to begin now with a good hard look at why it is we've lost our private property, why it is that we pay an inheritance tax, why it is that we send our children to the public schools and then complain because they're undisciplined and because they learn to roll reefers with their left hand, split lines of coke with their right, and lay the neighbor's daughter in the back of the Chevy van. And most of you say, but we don't want our children educated that way. And some of you have said, let's take them out of the public schools. And government now says, no, you can't do that. Is there a reason? Are children educated in public schools in Poland? They're educated in public schools in Arizona. Do the people in the Soviet Union practice free education for all children in public schools the way we do here? Why then should we think it a thing strange that we now have the same benefits or the same tyranny that has been imposed upon those people behind the Iron Curtain imposed upon us in Arizona? Let's take a break right here and we'll be right back.